Okay, do you hear me all right? Yeah. So, thank you everyone for joining this panel discussion on the dictatorship of the proletariat and the left. My name is Francisco and I will be moderating. So before we start, I would like to introduce Platypus. So the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So the prompt for this panel today, it reads, what was the Marxist understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat? How has our understanding of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat been shaped and changed over the course of the 20th century? What is its relevance for the struggle for socialism today? I will introduce our four panelists in the order they will be speaking. That's also the order they're seated. So David Harvey is a political economist and a deprofessionalized intellectual based in Leeds. For 16 years, he sold his labor power to Leicester University, where he was also active as a trade union organizer. Last year, he was sacked from that institution, along with many others, as part of an attack on both academic freedom and trade union organization. He's currently involved in various projects, including the After Mathematics video project, the Don't Pay campaign, which is seeking to mobilize 1 million households to refuse to pay energy bills, and the Institute for Commoning, which is setting up an independent two-year master's in commons administration. He's also a very inactive member of Plan C. Dr. Gavin Mendel-Gleason is a computer scientist and member of the Workers' Party of Ireland. He has written reviews and analysis of economic modeling and changes in the mode of production. He has also published academically on computational modeling on human societies and social stability. Then we have Olga Stefao. She's a journalist and a member of SYRIZA, newly elected to the Central Committee of the party, making her its youngest female member. She's in charge of the Human Rights Department in particular. And last, we have Theodores Palisades, who has studied economics and philosophy and is a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So the format of the panel will be that each panelist will have 10 to 12 minutes to address the prompt. And I will remind you when you have 2 minutes left. And afterwards, we will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to the initial remarks where you can respond to each other. And finally, we will open up for the Q&A with the audience. And that will be it. So I think we have the microphone in the middle, and David, you can start.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I think I want to split my remarks into 3 sections. First, I want to talk about language and rhetoric, and then I want to talk about class power, and finally I want to talk about kind of contemporary examples, and mostly from the field, I think, of commoning. So in terms of language and rhetoric, and here I'm drawing on mostly on the work of American socialist Hal Draper. So what Draper says, he kind of goes back to the work of Marx and Engels and looks at where they use dictatorship of the proletariat as a term. And the argument that Draper makes is that although Marx and Engels certainly used the term, it wasn't really their preferred term. They used it more as a rhetorical device. So where Marx and then where Engels used the term, they were intervening in political debates. And there were 2 particular debates they were intervening in. And these were kind of with what you might call frenemies or allies or potential allies in the socialist and communist movements. First of all, the Blanquists, and they believed in kind of tiny elite organization that would make the revolution and then take power. And secondly, those kind of more conciliatory socialists who believed that it was possible to work with the bourgeoisie. And so against the Blanquists, they were talking about a dictatorship of this minority of revolutionaries. And as a rhetorical device, Marx was saying, no, we want a dictatorship of the proletariat, as in the entire proletariat. Against those socialists who believed that it was possible to kind of work more democratically in a non-antagonistic way towards socialism and then communism, Marx and then Engels said, no, there is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We want instead a dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx and Engels, in a nutshell here, Marx and Engels were not decrying the term dictatorship of the proletariat, but it was not really their preferred term. They used it as a riposte really against those two other sets of movements. So what they really meant by dictatorship of the proletariat, and I think they probably use this term synonymously, and that's certainly Hal Draper's argument, they were talking about dictatorship of, class rule, the taking power, the exercising power of the proletariat or of the working class. The other point to make is that 150 years ago, and actually until the 20th century really, dictatorship was kind of an accepted term for government. It wasn't necessarily accepted by people who were struggling against it, but no one batted an eyelid if someone talked about dictatorship. Today, of course, dictatorship has really quite negative connotations. So in that sense, given the negative connotations of dictatorship, given that it was not Marx and Engels' preferred term, I see no reason why we should continue to use the word dictatorship. I also have some problems with the word proletariat. Again, I don't think it's a commonly used word outside of the left. I prefer the word working class. But even there, I have sort of some questions. I mean, even after the great doubling following, the so-called liberalization, the opening up of China, the opening up of the Soviet Union to international capitalist markets, even after that great doubling of the labor force over the past 40 years, there are still several billion people who we might describe as peasants or as commoners, who have a much closer relationship to the land, who they're not outside capitalism at all, but they have some access, direct access to the means of production. And I think as examples in Chiapas, the Zapatistas, and elsewhere in the world, I think there's no evidence to suggest that those people are less progressive, that they're more backward than working classes. So I think for those reasons, I think dictatorship of the proletariat is a really problematic word to use today. But let's think about what we might get out of it. Let's talk a little bit about class power. And we also need to think about state power, and we also need to think about transition, the transition from capitalism to communism. And here, kind of quite a useful article, and there's a book as well by Etienne Balibar, the French communist intellectual. And here he was kind of writing in response to the French Communist Party decision in 1975 or 76 to give up their aim of creating a dictatorship of the proletariat. And Balibar talks about the institutions of the state, he talks about the repressive apparatuses of the state, and he talks about the transition to communism. And for Balibar, he essentially says that the dictatorship of the proletariat is synonymous with socialism, as in we have capitalism, then we have some form of revolution, and we pass to socialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, and after that transitional phase that might last a very long time indeed, maybe decades or longer, then we move to communism. Now that sounds kind of more persuasive, but I also don't think that revolution really happens in that way anymore. So it seems to be, to me, almost an all or nothing understanding of history, and I think that's problematic. The state is capitalist. Yes, I completely agree with that. But we don't live under pure capitalism. To suggest that we live under pure capitalism concedes too much power to capital. I don't think there's an outside to capital, but there is an against capital, and there is a beyond capital. So this is why I think Marx wrote of the capitalist mode of production. Mode of production might be dominant, but it is never omnipotent. It is never all-powerful. So here, I like John Holloway's metaphor of the cracks, the interstices. It's in these cracks, perhaps we could say in these moments, socialism. It's in these cracks, the logic of capital, the law of value does not operate, or its logic is tempered by other values, values of humanity, of human need, of solidarity. And there are plenty of different words that people have used to express those other values. So I just want to sort of think about some of these examples of these cracks and how we attempt to keep them open, keep them existing, but also keep them open to new possibilities. And how we struggle to make new cracks, and how we struggle to link one crack to others. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples, actually 5 examples or 6 examples. Some of them are geographical and some of them are more by sector. So I mentioned the Zapatistas. For almost 3 decades now, Zapatistas have been developing, experimenting with autonomous spaces in Chiapas in the southeast of Mexico. Clearly, they have not escaped capitalism and the capitalist state, but they have a broad strategy to resist capital's incursions. So we might understand the way that the Zapatistas, if we want to use the phrase, the way they practice the dictatorship of the proletariat. There are multiple ways, but 2 of the main ways are the EZLN, the Zapatista Army, and also by the way they've reached out into civil society and other political movements in Mexico and across the planet, which has made it much harder for the Mexican state and for capital to attack them and to destroy their revolution. And this, of course, this is an example of a revolutionary group who are not primarily proletarians. Another example from Mexico is what some people described as the Oaxaca Commune. So between June and October 2006, Oaxacans, and these were more proletarian, but also indigenous groups from outside of the city of Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, they took over the city. For those 100+ days, there were no police. There were no authorities. The governor and so on, they were forced to meet in secret. Services like garbage collection and so on, they were self-organized by workers and their unions. And there was the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca as a coordinating body. So this might be a contemporary example of what Marx might have called the dictatorship of the proletariat. A final geographical example would be the decade-long revolution in Rojava. But there are also examples of sectoral moments, if you like, where capital's law of value is maybe not completely suspended, but its impact lessened. One good example, I think, of this is Britain's National Health Service. Clearly, it's in crisis now. It has been for a decade. Maybe it's always been in crisis. But Britain's NHS is an example of an essential service which was provided for 3/4 of a century on the basis of need, resourced collectively on the basis of ability to pay. Basis of need, ability to pay? Sounds familiar. I've heard that phrase somewhere before. Only a very small example, but health is an essential service. No wonder the neoliberals have always denounced the National Health Service as socialist. From completely outside of the state, though remember, though this is maybe not common knowledge, but Britain's National Health Service was based on the South Wales Miners' Welfare Associations. So the National Health Service was based on a bottom-up model. Okay, two quick other examples. One is the free software movement and Creative Commons. And this kind of, in a sense, this seems to coexist with capital, but it's like a legal hack to say, no, the law of value will not operate in this realm. So in that sense, it's a way of defending a non-capitalist space from the forces of capitalism and the state. And the final example, I'll just say in a sentence, is the various cities, I think there are more than 100 now, which have instituted, as a result of struggles, free public transport. Again, like health, an essential public service that people, the result of struggle, have said, no, we will not pay for this. This will be outside of the law of value. So I think if the dictatorship of the proletariat means anything today, it's in those sorts of examples.
Thank you, David. Gavin?
Thank you. Okay, in order to talk about the dictatorship, the proletariat, I think it's useful. Should I hold this further away? I'm getting a lot of echo there, sorry. I think it's useful to first talk about the revolution in permanence. So the revolution in permanence, I think the first person who articulated the idea was probably Jemmy Hope, who was an Irish revolutionary who took part in 1798 rebellion. And during that rebellion, there was a lot of aristocratic and bourgeois figures that were involved in the revolution. And in 1838, around 1838, he had an interview with someone who was extracted from him his feelings about this revolution. And he said, really, the problem was that the working class had not been at the forefront of this revolution. They'd essentially allowed it to be led by aristocrats, and they had not gone all the way. They were not willing to go all the way, and they were willing to make a compromise, and they basically were sold out. Subsequently, Marx writes a very similar account of 1848, in which essentially, because the proletariat, a very new body at the time, relatively disorganized and incapable of leading the democratic revolutions of the 1848s, was unable to wrest control over what was taking place in the revolution. And instead of getting a true and complete democratic revolution, they instead got something that was halfway. The revolution in permanence is the idea that the democratic revolution can be seized by the proletarians and then driven forward by the proletarian masses in order to do something further, not just a democratic revolution, but to push it into a social revolution and to actually change the mode of production. And I think Marx really looked at the Paris Commune as some kind of prototypical image of how that might take place. Now, the Paris Commune was a democratic revolution. So we're talking about something that is democratic. However, I think it's really important that we talk about the difference of democracy and dictatorship here as not being mutually exclusive, okay? So the foundation of social democracy also comes through this concept of trying to produce the revolution in permanence. So going back to the early foundation of the Social Democratic Party of Germany and of Austria, the concepts that they had were that what they would do is they would try to build up a force, a proletarian mass, a workers' movement, and they would force through a democratic revolution. At this time, there was not a democratic state in either Germany or in Austria. The Prussian state, the Reichstag, was not democratic. It had very little power. So the elections that they were taking part in were about showing the legitimacy of the movement, showing the masses were in support of something very important, the merger of the proletariat with the concept of social revolution, to actually change the mode of production and change the way that things were done through this democratic revolution. So now we have a very different sort of situation. Oh, I would just like to say the Bolsheviks also took this. It was not just social democracy in Germany. The Bolsheviks also had this concept of producing the democratic revolution. They were ultra democratic. They were very into democracy and using this change towards democracy as the fulcrum through which they would force through a change in the mode of production. So we're now in very different circumstances because we don't live in the same autocracies that we had at that time. We have something very different. We have a bourgeois democracy. And in a sense, I would like to say that they are completely and utterly fake. They are fake democracies, completely and utterly. And I'm not just using that as a rhetorical flourish, but if, for instance, Gillens and Page have an excellent analysis, which is a technical analysis of what kinds of sentiments the people who are voters have and what impact that has on policy. And in their statistical analysis, they found no measurable influence of the masses in the United States on policy whatsoever. It doesn't matter what they want, they don't get it, okay? And then he started looking at different groups, special interest groups, slight, very slight amounts. They could just move it microscopically. Trade unions, a little bit more as one of these special interest groups, right? And then people with money, that's where it all goes. All of the changes in policy are dictated by the bourgeoisie. It is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie through democratic means. So that's a conundrum for us, a puzzle. How do you solve this puzzle? And I think that this is something that we really have to be thinking about very clearly, because there is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And when I say a dictatorship, I really mean, I don't believe in the interstitial theory. I really don't accept that you can have two modes of production. There are not two hegemons. There are not two vlasts. There is one hegemonic power. There is one mode of production that is dominant. And that is really what exists. So capitalism is the dominant mode of production. The capitalists are the driving class and the driving force of our time, and they control almost everything, including the media. And that has a huge impact on us. So when you actually change the mode of production, you will have to suppress that class. It may be that you can do that through some sort of democratic means with a mass showing of the legitimacy of what you do. And in fact, I think it's probably necessary to show mass legitimacy if you're ever going to change the mode of production, because otherwise you feed reaction. So you need some way of demonstrating the masses, the greater masses, are in support of this change, because you're really going to have a fight on your hands from the current ruling class. But that class is going to have to be suppressed. There is going to have to be a dictatorship. You can't have both socialism and capitalism as a mode of production simultaneously. The capitalists don't allow it. So they don't allow communist parties to actually communize things. That's not allowed. In Germany, it's actually technically illegal. They actually banned the Communist Party in Germany in 1956 on the basis that changing the mode of production is illegal. It's a violation of rights. You could look that up. It's an interesting legal case. Okay, so what we have now though, okay, so there's lots of interesting things about how do we survive in this period in which we can't change the mode of production, because realistically, the entire overarching superstructure is controlled by the capitalist class. And they define the terms that we use, they define what is sensible, etc. And that makes it is a very serious problem for us. However, the dialectic is functioning. And what's going to happen is we are entering into a revolutionary period. I have never in my life seen anything like what is unfolding right now. What is happening right now is really going to be a revolutionary juncture. And we should be careful not to use the theories of the last 30 years for our understanding of what's going to happen next. Because what's happening next is going to be a terrible crisis of capital. And I don't mean like, one of these little, we're going to have a depression or something like that. I mean a severe and total crisis of the world system is going to come to fruition. This winter is going to be crazy. This winter is going to be utterly crazy. So we should be preparing for that eventuality. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? That's the question. And what I would say, what we need to do, I don't know how to do this, but this is what I think we need to do. We need to, as socialists, really merge with the workers' movement in the sense that we get the broader proletarian masses to believe in socialism. They don't right now. For the most part, they don't even think of it as a possible option. They think of maybe, you know, free trams, but they don't think about actually changing the mode of production, getting rid of the capitalist class, having a different way of doing things, having a different way of producing goods. And that's what we have to achieve. We have to achieve that aim, and we have to move the focus towards actually doing that to deal with this crisis that's going to arise. 3 minutes? Okay. Right. Okay, so in order to, the demands that we have to make should be communist demands. We shouldn't just reflect the demands that are going to be coming up from the people, because mass demands are often incoherent. Oftentimes they are not structured to think about how to actually alleviate the problem. What the problem is that capital is in the driver's seat. And so you can't just be screaming at them, oh, we have to socialize the means of production. You have to respond to their conditions with a proposal that starts moving us in the direction of the masses taking control of things and moving it towards socialization. So that's really the merger formula. The merger formula is merging the proletarian mass with the socialist movement. And aiming for the commanding heights is a really big question for us in Europe. So what is the commanding heights in Europe? If you took over any country in Europe today, you'd be screwed. And I think that's just the reality of it. Anybody who thinks that you can take over Austria or take over Germany even and be able to actually survive the kinds of capital strike that would obtain, you're wrong. We're far too integrated. Europe needs to do it in a much broader movement. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily the EU, but maybe the EU is not the worst thing to focus on. The Reichstag was totally undemocratic, completely undemocratic. The EU is totally undemocratic. So maybe it's precisely the right thing to go after, a very undemocratic autocracy where we build up a proletarian mass for a revolution to overthrow it, a democratic revolution that could actually win the commanding heights. And okay, I think that's my point.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. So now we have Olga.
Hello, it's Olga Stefao actually, and thanks for having me. So, well, if you want to take over any country in Europe, take us, take Greece. We're already screwed up the last 13 years. And we're going on. So please take us. It's not going to be a huge loss to anybody. Trust me. So, dictatorship of the proletariat. Let's admit that Marx was a very, very gifted author, a talented author. He was playing with words like in a masterpiece way. If you read his poems, you will understand. But even if you don't, if you read the manifest, it's basically a fairy tale for the working class with this huge ghost flying over Europe. It's not like Das Grundrisse or Das Kapital, which is really hard to read and to understand. The manifest was approachable to the working class. It was approachable because it was simple. It was using simple words and simple terms, which nowadays we don't. If we go anywhere to the European South and trying to persuade everybody, anyone, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, some light bulbs will just start striking. Salazar, Franco, Mussolini, Metaxas, the Greek junta. It has a totally different meaning through the 20th century because, let's face it, dictatorships led to World War II. So emotionally, people cannot cuddle over that. They cannot they cannot think themselves on something this bloody. And Are we proletariats? I mean, I see this group of people. Most of us, we are, well, most of us, we aren't millennial. You are Gen Z, X. Is X now? I'm a boomer too. This is why I'm asking. Yeah, you are much younger anyway. So I'm gonna tell a story like a proper old lady. In 2008, in Greece, we had this great uprising, the rebellion of December the 8th, the 6th of December. And we're nothing close to the Zapatistas or Oaxaca or even Marinaleda in Spain. We wanted to go and live there because it seemed like a great utopia, but it wasn't. It wasn't our utopia. For us, it wasn't our utopia. We took over the law school in Athens. They took over probably every university in Greece at the moment. And it was seemingly like the French May, but without the working class. So we were practically a bunch of youngsters fighting between us, whether the revolution will be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Unfortunately, it never happened. Instead, we gained the crisis. Anyway, at this time, Aristides Baltas, this great philosopher, Marxist, this great teacher, because I like to call Aristides a teacher, gathered us up, and he was like, kids, this is not the 1917 anymore. You're not to start a revolution the way Lenin did, and this is not the point right now, because right now the Greek government donated to the banks $28 billion to save it. It was before the crisis, but it was something going on. And this, to me, and I'm afraid I'll have to not exactly disagree with you, but escalate maybe. The crisis that is upcoming, it's not new. It started 13 years ago. It escalated with a war, because this is what capitalism do when capitalism is in crisis. And right now, it's our chance to take it over Greece. Thank you very much if you do that. Or for us to do something. But are we proletariats? That was I started to say. Well, I think we're precariats, a different species. We're precariats. We're quite not literate. We are pretty much accessible to knowledge. We work to schools or banks or very busy jobs. Is that cool for a boomer to say? Okay. But we're paid so little, right? I mean, who of you can be young and work and rent a proper home without their parents' help? Please tell me if there is anyone here. I want some advices, because I don't have any answers to that. So we're the precariat, and the precariat is a very snobbish and, well, I don't like the precariats because they want to be middle class, and middle class is dead. So I don't like them. They will not understand. We need new tools and new expressions to approach them. So if right now we're facing a different type of capitalism than neoliberalism, which comes with a different type of, well, I won't call it democracy, because I'm insisting it's neo-fascism, not post-fascism, not alt-right, it's neo-fascism. We are up against a very new and simultaneously a very old type of system, economically, socially, and politically. Very new and very old. It really reminds me exactly 1 century ago. Let's check in the historical events, okay? Like checking in a museum or something, or whatever you guys do in your age. I don't know. We have a pandemic. We have economical corruption in every level. We have the alt-right movement, which I still call neo-fascism. We have war. What else we have? I mean, I think pretty much we have everything. Yeah, that's true. We have that too. See, it never stops. It's ongoing. I mean, seriously, guys. So we have some chances to make revolution. I'm afraid SYRIZA is the living example that the socialism and capitalism do not coexist. Capitalism is like Pac-Man. You always lose in Pac-Man. We obviously weren't the ghosts. Yeah. And I want 3 minutes. I'm pretty much done. We said, we heard, and I agree that we had to, as the left, we had to deal with the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of the rich, of the upper class. In ancient Greece, there's this word called oligarchia, oligarchs. Oligarchs were pretty much this thing, the dictatorship of the rich. They were the very few rich people owning land, basically, who were dictating everybody else. But right now, we don't have several classes anymore. We don't have the upper class, the middle class, the semi-middle class, and the poor. We have two classes. They're the rich and they're the very poor. And Europe is changing rapidly with the refugees and the war and the crisis and the deaths because of the pandemic and the destroyed healthcare and going on. It's gonna take me like half an hour to still talking. So yeah, I don't like the term dictatorship of the proletariat. We use it sometimes when we are very drunk and listen to guerrilla songs and cry. Let's admit that we always do that. At least my friends and I do that. But I think it's not working as a term right now. Or please don't ever use it to any Southern European worker. It's not gonna be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Now, Theo.
Hello. From the whole notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, I will limit my remarks on the first part, that of dictatorship, because it's the most controversial. Of course, the second part of the proletariat is equally important, as we already listened to the remarks of the rest of the panelists. And I will just highlight some key aspects. I won't even attempt to exhaust discussion, but just I will try to provoke thinking. So concerning Marxism's take on the DOP, I will call the dictatorship of the proletariat, two quotes are important to keep in mind. One by Marx in a letter of during 1852. He wrote to Weidemeyer, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. What I did that was new was to prove that the existence of classes is only bound up with a particular historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. Lenin repeated this in full agreement and added that he wrote, "It is often said and written that the main point in Marxist theory is the class struggle, but this is wrong. And this wrong notion very often results in an opportunist distortion of Marxism." only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Lenin agreed with and repeated Marx, but in a new period and a new context, when Marxists were accusing each other of opportunism, of betraying Marxism, and of course, workers were killing each other in the name of their nation states during World War I, a period of acute social pathology when Marxism was strong enough in order to not remain a passive observer of the pathology, but actually being one of its key agents. Now, as Platypus emphasizes in its pedagogy, Marxism is the historical consciousness of not just the specific aforementioned pathology, but of the general pathology under capitalism. I just read you, for example, how Marx was explicit that the existence of classes is only bound up with a particular historical phases in the development of production. So let's delve a little into historical specificity. And since the DOP is bound up with revolution, it's crucial to understand the difference between the socialist and the bourgeois revolutions. As opposed to various anti-Marxist clichés, Marxism didn't analogize the revolutionary trajectory of the working class within the womb of capitalism with the one of the bourgeoisie within the womb of feudalism. Allow me to quote quite extensively from Rosa Luxemburg and her masterful Reform or Revolution. What distinguishes, she writes, bourgeois society from other class societies? The fact that wage labor is not a juridical relation, but purely an economic relation. In our juridical system, there is not a single legal formula for the class domination of today. For Luxemburg, wage slavery is not expressed in laws. Hence, wage slavery cannot be suppressed through the legislative way. She cites the Communist Manifesto to support her opinion, and the line from Marx and Engels that all previous societies were based on an antagonism between an oppressing class and an oppressed class. And she continues, but in the preceding phases of modern society, this antagonism was expressed in distinctly determined juridical relations and could, especially because of that, accord to a certain extent a place to new relations within the framework of the old. And she quotes again from the manifesto the line that in the midst of serfdom, the serf raised himself to the rank of a member of the town community. So she goes on. No law obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. Poverty, the lack of means of production, obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. And no law in the world can give to the proletariat the means of production while it remains in the framework of bourgeois society. For not laws, but economic development have torn the means of production from the producer's possession. For Luxemburg, it is one of the peculiarities of the capitalist order that within it, all the elements of the future society first assume in their development a form not approaching socialism, but on the contrary, a form moving more and more away from socialism. And skipping some parts, I will finish this extensive quoting from here to what is of interest to us here. She writes, in the field of political relations, the development of democracy brings the participation of all popular strata in political life and consequently some sort of people's state. But this participation takes the form of bourgeois parliamentarism in which class antagonisms and class domination are not done away with, but are on the contrary displayed in the open. End of quote. So, on the contrary, while the proletariat must seize political power first and suppress the capitalist system, for the bourgeoisie it was possible to first develop and become socially powerful within feudalism, and only after that seize political power. The bourgeoisie created beforehand its ideology, its distinct imaginary, which is a fancy word, in ways the proletariat cannot under capitalism, at least for Marxists, right? perhaps they're wrong. So the bourgeois revolution can appear as the legitimate political capstone of a social evolution, whereas the socialist revolutions will always appear as socially immature and hence illegitimate. The proletariat finds itself in need of political power in order to be actually empowered socially for the first time. So the proletariat's political revolution to conquest power is the start of the process, not the culmination of the process. This is something most non-Marxist socialists disagree with, and they rather expect day one of the revolution to be the end of the process of liberation. And certainly not dictatorial at all, something that proves that they have a bourgeois conception of revolution, thinking that the proletariat can achieve the same crucial preliminary gains under capitalism that bourgeoisie achieved under feudalism. A crisis of legitimization anticipated in any socialist revolution already displays itself in capitalist democracy. For example, during the first years of its financial crisis, circa 2010, Greece had to impose unprecedented austerity measures, and the legality or the constitutionality of the relevant memoranda of austerity was never and has never been raised as an abstract question of law, legality, justice, but rather as a series of exceptional measures in a state of emergency, in view of the objective to remain in the European Union, for example, etc. So they had to be implemented coercively as a life and death issue, and the question of their legality was to be adjusted accordingly no matter what. Capitalist democracy is in permanent crisis, and ignoring this fact leads to serious political paralysis. To cite an example, as you all know, a historical example, the Spanish anarchists defended Barcelona and Catalonia from the fascist coup in July 1936. When the fascists were ousted, the petty bourgeois Democrat governor of Catalonia, Louis Companys, said to the representatives of the CNT, "You are now in control of the city and Catalonia because we alone routed out the fascist militarists." Understanding that the CNT and FAI had the de facto control of the whole region, some anarchists proposed that the union should take power and overthrow the Generalitat and impose the anarchist vision of libertarian communism. But many others argued that this would be a dictatorship imposed by a minority. CNT-FAI had a simple but not a supermajority of 50+1% among the workers. And that would mean the imposition of an anarchist dictatorship, a Bolshevik-style coup. So after a heated debate, the Barcelona Labor Council voted against the option of taking power. By denying power, meaning denying transferring power to the new already formed workers' institutions and making them the sole source and embodiment of power, the anarchists facilitated the dictatorial concentration of power for other dubious institutions and agents. Avoiding imposing a dictatorship, they became adjuncts in other, far worse dictatorship. Okay. So the CNT-FAI leadership declined the dictatorship of the proletariat, the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but accepted the subordination of the revolutionary militias to the state in exchange for being granted for government ministries, etc. The rest is history. It's also funny, by the way, how the anarchist critics who attack Marxism for being dictatorial usually end up attacking each other for being authoritarian and crypto-Leninists, etc. Now, also Marxists have made similar mistakes, like in Germany in 1988. This is not limited to anarchists. I'm skipping some stuff. Okay, as opposed to the anarchists and some Marxists, what did Lenin and his fellow comrades achieve in their revolution? Let's listen to Luxemburg again. She wrote, "It's not a matter of this or that secondary question of tactics. but of the capacity for action of the proletariat, the strength to act, the will to power of socialism as such. In this, Lenin and Trotsky and their friends were the first, those who went ahead as an example to the proletariat of the world. They are still the only ones up to now who can cry with Hutton, "I have dared." So Lenin dared, according to Luxemburg. This doesn't mean that we always have to dare, but despising the DOP perhaps prepares well for such a betrayal of the moment that we need to dare. Because all big political shifts in mass capitalist politics raise the specter of dictatorship, nevertheless. Capital is pathological and revolution is a symptom of capital. So the key is not to just denounce social authoritarianism like anti-Marxist and to do, but assume responsibility for it and throw the authoritarian energy towards revolutionary goals. Lenin, for example, didn't denounce war, but aimed to turn it from a world war into a civil war. Now, while Marxists embraced the concept of DOP, the term itself didn't appear for a long time. It appeared massively during World War I, but initially in the program of Russian social democracy circa 1905. Because of time pressure, okay, I will wrap it up. I can discuss later why it appeared in this period. Time management. Okay, final point. The specter of dictatorship haunts us side by side with the specter of democracy, because revolution is not the victory of the good majority over the bad, nasty minority. The problem of capital is reproduced from below. Exactly when we, the majority, spontaneously reproduce bourgeois right and succumb to its contradictions. Hence, a revolution facilitates a long, challenging process of subjective transformation for the majority. This subjective aspect of social pathology to its ultimate repercussions is ignored by all other socialisms apart from Marxism. They tend to denounce the dictatorship only to conform in the present de facto dictatorial reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. Sorry, I had to cut you. Hope you can, during the Q&A, probably you can make your missing points. So we will have 2 to 3 minutes so you can respond to each other. If you can be precise, so we can open up for the Q&A, which it should be perhaps the most important part. And just a remark that I've noticed hearing you, I think that perhaps David and Olga, you agree that there are like potentially new subjects beyond the proletariat, and Gavin, you say that there's new uses of the state democratically. So it seems as have we moved beyond Marxist political moment, or have we fallen under and we're just accommodating ourselves politically to a reduced political horizon, perhaps? And Theo, isn't it true as well that the proletariat is nowhere to be seen politically today? Where does that leave Marxists? And can we achieve socialism without the dictatorship of the proletariat? Just remarks, you don't need to answer, but 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you. There's a lot to say. I think you're maybe right about new subjectivities, and I think this is what Olga was talking about needing new stories. And I didn't quite catch, but I think you said you hate the precariat because they want to be middle class. And I think that's a really important point because, you know, and I don't think actually we've moved beyond Marx, because I think Marx in several places says that the working class or the proletariat is the revolutionary class because it is the only class that can destroy all of classes. The working class wants to destroy itself. Nobody wants to be working class. I mean, this working class pride is bullshit because it means precariousness. It means, you know, making the the choice in Britain in particular today, but across Europe, between heating and eating. Do you want to starve or do you want to freeze? No one wants that choice, and that's the working class choice. We all want to escape the condition of being working class. But what do we escape to? We don't want to escape to being middle class, because that's just the capitalist solution. So that's kind of why we need new stories. And I think, what else can I say? But the point really is, I think we are talking about how to make a revolution, and I think that's what we're all talking about, and we're coming at it in different ways. I can't say any more, actually. I'll leave it for now.
Yeah, so just to talk a little bit about the different classes that exist. For the most part, so when you aim for revolution, you really have to aim for revolution in a polity. You need to have some notion of what the state is going to be, or where the state is going to reside. Because at that point, you're going to have to lead things forward. You're going to have to change the mode of production. There's going to have to be some governance structure. You can't just have an unfocused aim of what you're going to have revolution in. So we can't have a revolution for the global south or the peasants in these other areas. In Europe, the peasant class is basically liquidated as an element. I mean, it's not a very big thing. It's quite microscopic compared to the proletarian masses. So I think if in Europe, if the aim is a revolution in Europe, then really the aim should be proletarian revolution. If you have a mixture of classes, of course, you have to make accommodations for the mixture of classes. As the Bolsheviks did, it's the workers and peasants revolution, or the block of four classes, where you're even trying to have a revolution for a national survival like existed in China, where you need to have an even more expansive view of the classes that exist. In Europe, I think it doesn't matter that much. The other elements, the other like precariat or like fringe, or even the lumpen for that matter, don't really constitute a revolutionary subject, in my opinion. I would also say that I would warn against reducing our vision and aim in terms of how far we're okay. Reducing our aim, because I'm not joking. The situation now is totally unprecedented. We're talking about like 1905, 1917 type conditions that are going to obtain in the next period. And this is not an exaggeration. Germany's economy is collapsing. Germany is not Greece. This is a different situation. You know, I'm not saying that Greece is a basket case, but Germany was the leading hegemon of Europe. So when the hegemon collapses, there's something very different that's happening, right? The economy is really in crisis there, and the energy situation is very critical as well. And this energy situation comes out of a fragmentation of the world system that is very extreme. We're talking about, you know, real lines being drawn here between those people who are looking for a more multipolar system and those people in the United States who want to maintain US hegemony, and then it's vassal states like Germany who want to maintain their vassalage in the US imperial system. So, you know, Germany as hegemon of Europe was also hegemonized by the United States, who literally occupies them, by the way. Literally, their military bases are all over Germany, and they had, you know, repeatedly spied on by the CIA. And when it's found out, they are embarrassingly, you know, oh, sorry, we don't want to damage our relations with you, that you were spying on our prime minister, so we'll just shut up about it now. I mean, their domination is so complete that they're willing to kill their entire economy in order to go along with US measures. So this is going to lead to a massive crisis, and we're not done. We're not through it. And it is not like, you know, this is not a small recession. So we have to be thinking about revolution with a capital R, right? Because who else is going to take the revolution if we don't? It's going to be the radical right. The biggest threat right now is ringing around the center and trying to hold them up, because the center will not hold. We have to be figuring out how to take power. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Gavin.
Yeah, I have to agree. There is no center in politics right now, especially in Europe. But we always forget about Latin America these days. I mean, this is the European alt-right urbanism shitty thing. And this is Latin America with Chile and Bolivia and Venezuela. I mean, the West asked from Maduro for some oil. That was amazing. I was laughing for days. But anyway, Theodores says something super interesting. We have to separate the proletariat revolutions from the bourgeoisie revolutions. But I want to remind you of something. When Lenin started the revolution, he had the Mensheviks with him. And then he spent the next 2 years slaughtering them up. So he basically used them and then killed them to be the proletariat revolution, an accurate one. But there was different times because they were fighting against monarchy and dictatorship. It was a weird mix of things. But since history is a great lesson and how dictatorship of the proletariat communities can or cannot exist. In the late 19th century, in this very cute island of Kythera, they had an anarchist uprising. They killed all the bourgeoisie class, and they formed a public trials, public trials, and they formed their own economy. And then the British stepped up and they said, okay, you had some fun for 2 months now, we're gonna kill you. And they killed them all. So.
Okay, so I can share with anyone interested the rest of my remarks in an email if you want to follow the whole argument. Excellent introductory remarks by everybody. I will just comment a few that I find interesting. David mentioned Hal Draper. I think anyone interested in the subject should read his books about the issue, 2 volumes. Indeed, he claims that they use it rhetorically, but I'm not totally convinced because Marx and Engels continue to use the term, not in, of course, the programs of the party or the public statements, but inside the Marxist organizations. And they used it even after Blankism and other tendencies declined. Especially Engels was using it till the end of his life, and the same reason didn't persist, how to convince Blankists out of mistake. I'm not completely convinced by Draper. Also, he says they just mean a worker state with a dictatorship of the proletariat and nothing more, not specific institutions or actions. But the point is that exactly all states are dictatorial, even the most democratic one. The most democratic is a form of coercion of the minority by the majority. So the question remains why the state problem persists after the revolution. Okay, I would like to comment also about the hallway and the cracks. These moments of socialism, I will just mention that instead of opening up possibilities, they also reconstitute capitalism in new unprecedented ways. So they open up the need for politics. So I wouldn't put it like that they are moments of socialism. They are moments of potentiality, let's say. About what Francisco mentioned about Marxism without the proletariat. Proletariat, of course, is also an objective category that, let's say, from a sociological perspective, proletariat continues to exist objectively. It doesn't exist subjectively. I mean, for Marxists, the term was not just a description of society, but it was objective and subjective at the same time. So you cannot have the proletariat without Marxism, or in general, without socialism, in order to have this category. So we have to facilitate the subjective reconstitution of the proletariat instead of, you know, waiting passively for the reality to tell us what is proletariat or what will follow after the proletariat. And finally, about the split with Mensheviks, exactly, it's interesting that the split within the Russian social democracy happened because parts of Marxism were insisting that the conditions are not ripe for revolution. So the Marxists themselves became the bastion of reaction, of counter-revolution, and not only in Russia, but internationally. So I think that demonstrates how revolution under conditions of capital means deep conflict, where workers attack other workers, and Marxists will attack other Marxists, and socialists other socialists. Capital is the soil of division. And this division should be channeled politically towards specific goals through organized institutions and parties of the working class. The key is that the state persists after capitalism, not because the last remnants of capitalists need to be suppressed, but because the workers will have to discipline other workers and the unemployed still to implement the bourgeois right, which for Marx is the unequal, the equal law, which is unequal law for unequal labor. Okay, this is a bit strange. Marx says about it in the Gotha program, the critic of the Gotha program, that the state needs to impose this injustice of equal pay for equal work. This is a huge injustice and creates social pathology and the need for armed workers to enforce it to other workers. So the problem remains even without capitalism, and the working class has to politically deal with it after the revolution, even after the suppression of capitalism, of capitalists.
Thank you, everyone. So now we can open up the discussion. I see already many hands. Is somebody gonna be Felix? I see Ephraim, Danny, you, Farsad. There we have 4 already. Is this working? You can test it. So. Okay, Richard had posed a question before. Let's give him. Oh, Richard, you can raise your hand. There he is.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. The first question is, what does the panel think is the relationship between the volonté générale, the general will of Rousseau, and the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat? And if there's a connection, can Bolshevism then be seen as a form of 20th century Jacobinism? And what would that mean? And the second question is, what is the relationship between the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the idea that socialism requires a collective planned economy after the bourgeoisie has been expropriated? So if the former, the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is no longer valid, does that mean that the latter is also no longer valid?
Is a question for the whole panel, Richard?
It's there for the whole panel, anybody who wants to answer either question.
Gavin, were you raising your hand? I think they're on the screen. What is the relationship between the general will of Rousseau and the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Maybe. Anyone?
I can also try.
Yeah. Okay, Theo.
It is indeed related with the volonté générale problem. Actually, the socialist movement inherited the term through the Babeuf, who used it during the bourgeois revolutions, and that's where the Blanquists take it from. So it's a legacy of the bourgeois revolutions expressed in ideas like the Rousseauian ideas. But only if we consider the historic viewpoint, there are similarities. Indeed, there was a dictatorship in Paris in 1792, for example, but not from an abstract viewpoint. It wasn't necessary, the dictatorship, in ways that it is after the Industrial Revolution, where the social pathology becomes acute. And as Marx says, in this new condition, right meets right. So there is it's not the bourgeois consciousness against feudalism, but it's a crisis within the bourgeois consciousness. Right meets right, says Marx, and then force decides. So it's much acute, and both from abstract and historical viewpoint, whereas in the bourgeois revolutions, it was only from the historic viewpoint, but not from the abstract viewpoint. And about the planning, I mean, it's there is a relationship, because the point is that the working class must assume responsibility for the social pathology. So how this will exactly happen, planning or perhaps utilize some markets, etc., it's a different question. The term doesn't is never specified in, for example, that it equals planning. It's assuming responsibility politically, the working class, the proletariat, for all these kind of decisions, planning, markets, etc.
Thank you. David?
Hi. In terms of the first question, I'm going to pass on that. I'm neither a Bolshevik, oh, no, thank you. No, I'm not a Rousseauian, and as I said, I'm not really sure about the validity of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the second, I think collective planning is absolutely necessary. I mean, in terms of, we look at the climate emergency, that needs collective planning on a global scale, and basically, you know, in a sense, an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, we have to stop the fucking fossil fuel companies from extracting more fossil fuels. Absolutely, that's what we need. And in terms of the rest of the collective planning, I kind of think it kind of cascades down. I mean, some collective planning could be at the level of a street or a neighborhood, and it's so self-similar from a street all the way up to the planet. But yeah.
Right, thank you. Should we move, or do you want to have a take on it?
I don't know the concept of the volonté générale, so I can't really comment on it. And in terms of planning, I'm a big advocate of planning. I think, you know, in the transitional period, we will probably have some sort of indicative planning with markets, but we will have to plan, as was mentioned, CO2 releases, the output products of all of human waste, etc., that isn't being internalized into the economic system, but is externalized as if it's nothing to do with us. All of that has to be internalized, and that doesn't happen without some sort of planning regime of some sort.
Hey, Galvin, just Just to add very, very briefly, now that you spoke about the volonté générale, it's the volonté générale versus the willingness of the majority. General versus the majority. The dictatorship of the proletariat cannot but appear to be lawless. There is no legal foundation for it yet, because it's in a process of formation. So it indeed resembles volonté générale as against a concrete volonté of the majority.
Thank you. We can move now to the floor. I'm sorry.
Just one comment. I mean, for the general planning, obviously I agree with the climate crisis. I think we're all gonna die because I'm that pessimist. And because I'm that pessimist and we are all gonna die, have you ever watched Monty Python's movies where they're trying to save Jesus from the crucifixion, and there is the one party of the Galilee and the other part of the Galilee and the third part of the Galilee and the fourth part of the Galilee trying to do one simple thing to hide Jesus from the crucifixion, and they just keep fighting. And since I'm the living example of how the Greek left are fighting right now and used to fight back in 2015, I'm not pretty sure we can achieve the very necessary general planning. So maybe we should have some backup. I don't know what it is. I have no idea. It's a discussion, so maybe we can find some ideas here. But I have no trust on us, to be honest.
Thank you. So Ephraim was first.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Ephraim from Platypus, London. A couple of comments, and then I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts. Firstly, just on the what Gavin said about the Irish revolutionary who recalled in 1838 that the problem had been the absence of a working class leadership. It's obviously significant that in 1838 is the first major Chartist position. And it really is Chartism that puts on the table the issue of the rule of the working class. And I think that's probably colouring his memory of the 1790s, but is a very significant and probably under-discussed issue here. But I wanted to turn to Marx's use of the dictatorship of the proletariat with respect to the Paris Commune. The other phrase that comes up is the special bodies of armed men, right? The need to smash the special bodies of armed men and form, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also have workers' militias and so on. And, you know, Marx was also making that argument in the context of the First International vis-a-vis other socialists, people like Charles Odger and the British trade unionists who supported the initial revolution in France that was apparently democratic and then refused to support Paris when the proletarian uprising happened. And what Marx says in the Civil War in France is that the working class cannot lay hold of the capitalist state and use it for its own purposes, right? And I guess where the left is at currently seems to be that the imagination of the left is about using the state apparently for its own purposes, right? Whether to stop fossil fuel production or to redistribute wealth. And we've been through this kind of whole experience of millennial socialism or neo-social democracy that really came as a response to the failure of the kind of experience Olga had in Greece around 2008 to 2010. And I think that, so I'd be interested in getting your response to, you know, how the imagination of the left today deals with that issue of the special bodies of armed men, right? We saw this with the George Floyd protests, that the call was to defund the police and install social workers, right? The imagination is kind of limited to just reproducing this these special bodies of armed men in whatever form they may be. So to get your response to that, but also I think that the kind of catastrophism you're putting forward about the coming period, and the idea that that's somehow a revolutionary opportunity, I would suggest is conditioned by the failure of that recent turn towards neo-social democracy, and that in a kind of despairing moment, we look for the crash to kind of carry us quickly to some kind of forward place. The growth of the socialist workers' movement in Europe in the Second International came not with a crash, but with a boom period, right, where there was great industrialization in Germany, for example, or in parts of the Russian Empire. So just to get your response on that, like it actually, when shit really hits the fan, it's not actually necessarily a good time for revolution, especially as the left is so irrelevant in the greater social processes.
Thank you, Ephraim. Was that directed to someone? Or Gavin? Yeah.
Okay, so first, the state and the bodies of armed men. So smashing the state is going to be necessary, but that means forming bodies of armed men and women in order to smash the state. And those, we do have to reproduce much of the aspects of the bourgeois state. And it is an imaginary, just total fantasy to believe that you can somehow change the structure of power when at the end of the day they can shoot you. If in the end of the day they can produce these armies and crush you, then you're done. And they will, and they have professional armies. Now, the problem is very immense. How to restructure, like just taking over the capitalist state is impossible. There's aspects of it that you could grandfather in completely, like the NHS, something like that. You'd almost, you could restructure it a bit, but you wouldn't have to like smash it, right? You don't want to smash the NHS. But then there's things like MI5, MI6, CIA, and you will have to actually literally smash that institution completely. And you'll have to scatter or, suppress all of the elements that came from that. And you will also need to have some sort of secret service to deal with the fact that there are going to be secret plots against you. And that's just a reality of the transitional period. I mean, it's a fact that can't be escaped. It may not be nice, but it's true. And it will happen in every revolution, no matter what. There isn't an escape from it, no matter how much you would like. Now, I used to be an anarchist. So I came from a much more like, open, oh, we're going to have this nice, lovely democratic revolution and it's all going to be flowers and whatever. But, I started reading a lot and I realized that that's just never the way the power transition. It doesn't happen that way. I was naive, and I think we should stop being naive about these sorts of things. It's ugly, but it's true. The second is that the origin of my belief in the crisis does not come out of a lack of political belief. So I've been organizing politically on the basis of something that was much more like the slow building approach that I saw that the Social Democratic Party of Germany had used in the early period, because it felt to me like maybe that's the right kind of thing to be doing in our period. However, factors that are objective have made it clear to me that that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is a big or revolutionary crisis that is unavoidably going to happen. And so I've been a part of like doing social modeling on collapse, crisis, and revolution, where we look at long scale historical trends, map many different variables, feed them in, and see what leads to social crisis. And what is happening right now was predicted already by the model that we're using in 2010. And it's happening now-ish. Right? And it really is happening. Like we predicted it back then, and now it's happening now. This is a revolutionary crisis that's objectively true. I mean, it's just going to be there. Now, whether or not we can take advantage of it, that's a serious effing question. That's a huge problem because we are so weak. The socialist movement is incredibly weak. I don't think it's ever been this weak. Like the workers and socialist movement is at its absolute lowest ebb. So this isn't a hope. I'm terrified by this situation because it is like an 1848 situation. It means we're going to be going in with nothing. And what's going to happen is reaction is going to come out the other side, most likely. But we should be preparing for that eventuality and try to make sure that we at least take something out of the revolutionary juncture, or don't let the reaction take total control of what happens in that situation. So yeah, that's.
Thank you, Gavin. Do you have something to say, Olga?
I do. There's another thing that Marx said, that when you're at the point, there is no return, at the bottom of the barrel, at the bottom of the society, the only way is up. So we're actually at the bottom of the society right now, or we will be in this winter. It's approaching pretty fast, and I believe we are already crushed. If not crushed, we're cracked in some places, and it's spreading through the rest of the body. But, well, I'm a Marxist, and I believe that there's only a way up. So right now, the social movements are like, okay, it's bullshit, it's bollocks. But it's a clear necessity that we need socialism in general, and social movements especially, to survive, not to be to live a better life, but to survive all in all. So I guess we're gonna make it because it's necessity.
Thank you. Next question, Danny.
Yeah, my name is Danny. I'm from Platypus, Philadelphia, and I just wanted to return to two things that Francisco raised. So one, socialism started off like not just a middle class, but even a capitalist reform, meaning Robert Owen. And so in a sense, being wealthy or being a capitalist, there's nothing necessarily like effrontery or offensive of socialism to the capitalists. They might think it's completely rational. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was aware of Robert Owen as well. And so I bring this up to say, do we really need a dictatorship of the proletariat for socialism? I know there's been some skepticism raised today, but just thinking in terms of the 20th century, people point to other examples of what seem to be revolutionary, democratic, socialist examples. I'm not saying whether or not this is true, but they point to that as kind of, refuting that kind of dogma that seems to have been passed down. And then I just wanted to make a comment for something that Theo said that might get at the thrust of my question right here. So I think, Theo, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said something along the lines of the class is objectively there today, but not subjectively. And I guess I bring that up. Yes, I think there are working class and wage laborers today, but I also think of the letter that you read right there in terms of Marx saying, all I showed was the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And when he showed that, it wasn't like a formula he worked out, it was something, there was a live example that he could point to. And he points to it later in the Paris Commune. He says, even the capitalists look to the French proletariat as leading them politically. And so I raised that so as to say that to the degree that that potentiality gets either liquidated or obscure or opaque in practice, then it actually kind of points backwards and it raises the whole question of like the proletariat, and it makes that unclear as well. Or to quote Lenin, without the idea of the proletariat, then it's just a sum of trade unions. Like, yes, they're oppressed and everything like that, but it's not really that necessity that Marx is showing. So, just to put everything again, do we need the dictatorship of the proletariat for socialism? And then kind of my comment getting behind where that thought is coming from.
Thank you. I have the guy with the blue t-shirt, yeah. Does someone want to comment on that? I'd rather have one by one. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, Danny or for Theo.
Yes, as I said in my speech, this is the Marxist perspective, but perhaps Marxism is not possible still. And I think the questions are related. if there is an objective aspect that survives. If it doesn't survive, then I think we can question if we still live under capitalism, and hence if Marxism is relevant or not, which is a question Marxists faced during the 20th century, from Trotsky saying that post-Second World War, without revolutions, perhaps we have to completely change our ideas, and of course Adorno, how he tried to remain a Marxist in these conditions. So I was just trying to describe what Marxism implied, and of course it's a question if this is still valid for all of us to think of, this objective and subjective sides, this dialectic, let's say.
Yeah. If you would like to say something, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some capitalists who care about inequality, some capitalists who care about climate change, but I don't think that does away with the need for us to exert our own needs. And, you know, to the extent that I do agree that, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat is relevant, yeah, we absolutely need to exert our power to suppress the desires and the plans of the capitalist class as a whole. Warren Buffett cares about inequality, but you know, I don't see any benefit to me, to my class.
Right. Next question.
Okay. In Das Kapital, Marx spoke of natural laws of capitalism, and first, they are only natural in a historical societal sense, and second, they can be sublated. They can be sublated. But how? In capitalism, both social relations and the consciousness are reified by the rules that capital sets for itself through the means of a certain society. The problem is the problem of ideology and the society keep reproducing itself through being necessarily unconscious about itself. So I want to raise the question, how do we address the reified consciousness and social relations politically, whether or not it's through the dictatorship of the proletariat?
And please,
I want to have an answer of all of you, even a short one.
Sure.
Well, I've been waiting for a question like that because I'm the only female participant in this panel, and I was dying to put the feminist aspect in something. Well, capitalism is a brilliant system. If it wasn't, we would have been done with it for like 2 centuries ago, and we didn't. Capitalism can embody anything, can embody every radical movement. It embodied the feminist movement. It used to be radical when women were workers, female workers were struggling for, you know, the 8-hour per day working time. They embodied it. Then there are the suffragettes, and they embodied them too. So right now we buy so many fancy clothes and so many good makeup stuff and etc. So capitalism can embody anything, and this is why it's so hard to kill it. It's like an ancient Greek monster with so many heads. It's called Lerneidra. I don't know how it is translated, but the thing is that I kind of believe that we need some small, maybe larger parts of resistance to make it even larger and even larger and even larger, because, well, it's gonna be done within a day. And frankly, Marxists, we are a bit snobbish towards each other mostly. So we are not exactly the most friendly kind of types to discuss. Just like in the first international, someone said, yeah, it didn't went well. So yeah, to me, the answer for right now is solidarity. And it is the way to show how we can organize ourselves, because we lack on organization between us.
Yeah, no, I'd have to reiterate that about solidarity. I think it is actually probably the most important thing that's going to happen in the next period is the socialist movement actually demonstrating solidarity in a very real way to deal with crisis, because we are very unlikely to actually seize control of power through this revolutionary period. So coming out the other side in the Phoenix strategy may be the best one at this point, trying to come out of the ashes. So, but in terms of value, like one of the great like puzzles that Marxism, I think, poses very well is that the ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. The ruling class's ideas are pervasive, and the internalization, the fetishization of commodities, the entire thing functions on the basis of all of us sort of believing in it. That's how it works. And yet you can't just break it by trying to, you know, convince the population one by one that it's a bad idea. You actually do have to go through some sort of like contradiction. The contradiction has to be opened up internally inside of the system. And sometimes it does have to be fissures and cracks, especially when that's all you have. But, you know, when it really opens up into a gaping chasm, then you should really strike at the core and say, actually, we need to abolish the law of value. So, and that's the problem that is posed for us, how we can fuse with the proletarians again, how to get the proletarians to believe they exist in the first place, and then to fuse with them with the idea of what we do with the proletariat power.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. We need better stories, something Olga said at the beginning, and solidarity, but I think we need those concrete examples. I mean, the times people, we feel like we have no control over our lives. It's not only that we lack material needs, but we feel like we have no control over our lives. And some of the moments I felt most alive is when I'm involved, you know, in the crowd as part of that movement with a collective around me where I'm listening and I'm being listened to. And, you know, in a sense, the more people that experience that, it's like, my goodness, like these moments are more fulfilling than any other aspect of my life. Whatever the might, you know, color television, whatever the latest fashion, it's like being with comrades. That's the most fulfilling thing.
Yeah. And Theo, do you have something to say? Or next one, yeah. Farsad, and also if you could address to someone in particular, I think.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry. You guys briefly touched upon the role of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transitionary period from in which society is transformed, and I want you guys to maybe elaborate on the dictatorship of the proletariat in the sense, and my question would relate to this aspect insofar as I would ask all of you guys, in what way the dictatorship of the proletariat would create the conditions under which the transformation of society could be grasped and performed by society.
And now I think it's Tobias. But does someone want to, was it also for everyone on the floor? Okay.
This is one of my favorite questions, but honestly, it's like a 16,000 page essay. You know, I mean, it's really complicated. And I think, you know, both all of the major, like the one major revolution that really totally changed the mode of production in the Soviet Union, that, I mean, whatever you think it was coming out, it definitely wasn't capitalism after that transition. They did change the mode of production. And that transition took a long time and was very messy. And I have lots to say about it, but I think it's too long of an answer.
To give an example, today when, for example, a squad is evacuated by the cops, for example, okay, occupied place, the cops invade, they throw the people out. Okay, we try to think who's responsible for that. We think that the capitalist owner of the building block is responsible for that, okay? We tend to accuse certain people about this problem, but we have to think who is really responsible. We have to think the possibility that the cops are evacuating this place because there are workers who are saying that we pay rent, we have to work to pay rent, and you're not suffering the same way with us. You just have a free place. So what I want to say is that the dictatorship of the proletariat removes obstacles of consciousness. It removes the problem of the capitalists. It removes the problem of the Zionists. It removes all these issues. And the working class itself has the political opportunity to face its own self-contradiction. The fact that we see ourselves of commodity, and the only way of life that we know to live is by measuring value through labor time. So revolution allows to deal with this problem for the first time. And for Marx, all the problems in capitalism has this root, this objective aspect. So DOP give the resources also, it gives jobs to everyone, etc., in order to deal with this problem for the first time seriously, as I understand it.
Next one, yeah, Tobias.
Yeah, thanks to the panelists. My question refers to something Theo already touched on, but I think it was not elaborated on very much. And my question goes to the first three speakers. And that's, if I understood you correct, all of you agree that we are still living under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. But all of you seem to understand this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie as the dictatorship of the capitalists, meaning as kind of the collective individuals, let's say, of this class. And this is the main source of the problem. But as I understand Marx and Marxism, the real problem that it saw was actually capital, meaning the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie as the global dictatorship of the capital. Of capital, and the problem with that is, right, I mean, you could probably kill like the capitalists, but it wouldn't solve the problem of capitalism, because capitalism is not reproduced by the capitalists but by labor. So I guess my question, the title of this conference is The Crisis of Society in the Left, and my question is like, what is actually the crisis of society that Marx is responding to with the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and what do you think this crisis is? Thanks.
So it's addressed to the first three panelists. Would you like to start, David?
Yes, that's a really good question. And we have been, particularly over the past 40 years, we have been, our socialization is that there, you know, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. And this is one reason, again, why we need news stories, so that we don't always try and solve our own personal problems through the market. But I think it's also the case that there is a capitalist class. We can identify some of its members. They do plan. That's what the World Economic Forum is about. That's what the IMF is about. That's what the World Bank is about. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to accept that the capitalist class plan. and this is what Gavin was talking about in terms of the complete absence of democracy. I mean, this, you know, what people in Britain want: National Health Service, nationalised energy companies, nationalised railways and transport system. We've wanted those things consistently by large majorities for several decades. Not a chance in getting them under any of the governments. So I agree, but I also think that there is a capitalist class that exists as a class and plans as a class to subject us both materially and through ideology and hegemony.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that entirely. In terms of capital and actually the transition to a different mode of production is necessary to abolish the law of value. It's necessary to change the way in which we allocate goods for the means of production and change both, departments of the economy. That has to happen, right? And you're right that you could kill loads of capitalists and the system would still be able to reproduce itself. The Bolsheviks found it enormously difficult. Then they went through a long period until 29 when they really started moving to something else. But during that entire period, there were capitalists popping up all over the place inside of a system in which they were really not very afraid to utilize the power of the state to suppress them. So it's hard to do, and it's not just about the individuals, it's about the way in which the system reproduces itself, but it's also hard to change that system, and we should be ready for those difficulties. But there also is a capitalist class. We shouldn't shy away from saying it or be afraid to note that they are indeed planning our suppression and extraction of labor value from us.
Well, I do agree. Of course, there is a capitalist class. It's not maybe a unified thing. It's not something you can put your finger on it and be sure that this is the capitalist class. But my question is there a working class? Like, is there a unified working class? Because we have the workers who realize that they are poor and they want to do something about it. We have the Luban elements of the society who actually, okay, I don't want to talk about it right now because I'm going to be bitter and maybe a bit depressed. And we have the poor people, the precarious, our generation, who don't realize we are working class. So the best thing capitalism did is to try to persuade us we're different between us, and we're not. We have the same problems, the same poverty, the same healthcare drama. I heard you, David, say that a lot, and it's probably the worst thing capitalism can do to a society, destroy the healthcare system. We have them controlling the press, the media, the voice, which is the voice. And I don't believe we as the working class realize we are a very, very, very connecting, compact class, because the capitalists do, we don't. And that's the thing that scares me the most in this class war.
No.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't addressed today. So we have one question there, then you, and then Rebecca. And we'll see if I can fit you.
Hello, I'm Lara. I'm associated with the Leipzig chapter, and I came to Platypus from the climate movement. So I'd like to say something about imagination and the left and the ecological crisis, and then ask a question. So what I think are the two, I think what the planet and the left have in common at the moment is that they exist in a state of fragmentation. They're basically both fragments of something that once was functional and now isn't anymore, or is with the planet starting to not become functional anymore. And I think the most interesting political questions of the 21st century are which tools would be necessary to restore the left and also to restore the planet. And I think what really concerns me is that the left seems to be only able to imagine the climate crisis as or the end of the world or the end of capitalism. And I would like to explain why I think both is incredibly wrong and is an ideological obstacle to understand the ecological crisis and the changes it's going to bring in capitalism that would be so important to understand and analyze as Marxists. So there would be so many ways to technologically solve the problem, to cool the planet. For example, you can do something called stratospheric aerosol injection, which is injecting aerosols in the stratosphere to cool the planet. It would change the color of the sky to red or white with substances that are currently discussed. Also, there's the possibility to feed cows algae to completely eliminate the methane emissions that they're producing. And what I find so interesting is that the left, instead of looking at those possibilities and all the amazing things that something like green growth could bring to humanity, chooses to imagine this as the end of the world. And I'm wondering why. Yeah. And I would like to ask why the left currently doesn't seem to be able to see something else for the future than or a ginormous crisis washing away capitalism, or we are all going to die.
Is that for everyone? I think, yeah. I think you, Gavin, were the one.
I just wanted clarification. Are you saying that injecting aerosols into the atmosphere or green growth are good ideas?
Yes.
Okay, well, I completely disagree. I think when we're talking about geoengineering, who's going to control that? As I see it, green growth, geoengineering, you know, feeding algae to cows, these are all parts of a way of responding to the climate crisis, but changing nothing else. It's harnessing, you know, it's harnessing the climate crisis as a way of perpetuating a capitalist system and further subjugating human beings, the working class, to capital's rule. So I'm totally opposed to those sorts of solutions in inverted commas.
Yeah, so I'd be very much a technological possibilist. I think that we can do lots, and we will have to engineer lots of solutions to things. I think that's going to be necessary because we're going to have climate change and climate crisis. We're also going to have climate amelioration, and mitigation against the problems that we're going to experience. That's going to be a necessary phase. I just don't believe that any of this will stop until capitalism is gone. I don't think that there is any way to stop them from externalizing everything all the time. There's just no, the law of value tries to use everything as a resource and externalize as much as it can, because you can look at the equations as much, if you don't have to pay for it in the equation, you can sell it with a smaller C at the end, and that means you can flood the market, drive your competitors out of business. So there's just no way it's ever going to happen within capitalism. They'll do everything they can to externalize costs.
Well, actually, Marx was the first one to say that capitalism, in order to survive and grow, needs to destroy the environment. So pretty much this is what they do. If we are trying to minimize the cost by little solutions, we're going to lose. We have to take great measures and change the climate crisis the faster we can. So yeah, I'm afraid that capitalism is actually feeding of destroying the environment and feeding of destroying everything who is actually good in a society, they're feeding of that. They're like, you know, vampires who are trying to feed over everything to survive. The nature is the first thing you can feed off,
right.
Logically.
Maybe let's move to the next one if we come back. It's a bit out of scope with environmentalists, but we have Rebecca and we have you, and I hope we're almost on time. I think in 10 minutes it's going to be 2 hours, but if you can stay 10 more minutes, it would be appreciated. Rebecca.
Hi, so previously the panel, or it's been mentioned in the panel, that the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a controversial one, right? And I would hazard a guess that the reason it's controversial is because of the history of its failure, or maybe its success in the USSR, right? When we think the dictatorship, it's that authoritarian dictatorship, and the kind of liquidation of emancipatory politics in those regions. Of course, this is disputed, and if you disagree, then I'd like to hear why the USSR or other examples like North Korea or China might be an example of a successful dictatorship of the proletariat. But I guess the question is, you know, was that a definitive failure, right? Is the USSR a definitive no to the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Now, that's kind of the overarching question. More specifically, when did you feel like the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat was proven or disproven for yourself in your education in politics and the left? And how do we turn the history of the Stalinist dictatorship of the USSR into a productive history for future emancipatory politics?
Someone. We could, yeah, you're right. We have concluding remarks. Yeah, let's right. Let's add the questions and let's do our last round of concluding remarks. Thank you, Theo.
Okay. Hello, I'm Lucas from Platypus Vienna. I wanted to ask the following question. Theo shortly mentioned the term of the case of emergency and how dictatura was kind of an answer to this case of emergency. And we talked a lot about like the dictatorship of the proletariat on the one hand and like dictatorship of capital or the capitalists or the bourgeoisie on the other hand. And it seemed to me that especially the first two panelists were talking about the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or of the capitalists as something that was in the interest of those who wanted to maximize their profits. Whereas I understand Marx in a different way, like the prototypes of capitalist politicians that he criticized or that he criticized the socialist support for were like on the one hand, Louis Bonaparte, who was like a student kind of Saint-Simon, so was also socialistly influenced. And he was like not just minimizing state influence and maximizing profits, but like starting big taxation of the citizens of France, and was feeding the poor, feeding the lumpenproletariat with sausages, like as Marx says in the 18th Brumaire. And on the other hand, we have Bismarck, who Lassalle kind of flirted with, and who was like introducing the social insurance. And like both of these are not Marxists or for the dictatorship of the proletariat, but specifically by managing the crisis, giving a possibility for capitalism to reproduce in the crisis. And I wanted to ask you, like, it seemed to me that like you were also suggesting kind of that what we need now is solidarity, what we need now is something like the NHS, but bigger and better. But isn't this also what keeps capitalism continuing? Like, isn't this capitalist politics? And what would be the difference then of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Because it seems to me not like intervening in a capitalist economy by politics is what is necessarily overcoming capitalism, but what is keeping capitalism going on. Yeah, do you agree with that, or do you disagree?
So we have two more and then concluding remarks. It's true.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Henry. I'm also from Leipzig, and thanks for the discussion. My question is basically going into a similar direction as Lucas's, which is I've recognized the term Bonapartism has pretty much been absent in this discussion, which is interesting because that's pretty much what brought Marx to the conclusion that there is the necessity of having a dictatorship of the proletariat. I did get the sense that you guys might have understood the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie pretty much as the dictatorship of the capitalists, but isn't the term Bonapartism precisely getting at the problem that there's a suppression of civil society through the state, including the capitalists themselves, right? And yeah, maybe you could talk about this relation or maybe even contradiction between the capitalists and the state, or would you suggest that there's like a direct class rule in and through the state by the capitalists or something like that? Yeah, maybe you can say something about Bonapartism.
The last one, Patrick. Yeah.
Oh, hi. So kind of like following on, I think, from like Henry's question and something which has been sort of,
one more,
you know, in the kind of area of discussion generally, is I just wanted to, you know, pull back briefly to the discussion to like the question of like the party and its like relationship to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the sort of, you know, Henry was talking about like Bonapartism and the sort of like the lesson of like 1848 being the sort of the necessity of, you know, an independent mass sort of organized sort of socialist party in order for the working class to like take power. So I just wanted to like get the panelists like view on the necessity of the party for the sort of in relation to the dictatorship of the proletariat.
So it's the very last one, I promise.
Hello, I'm Darren from Platypus, Vienna. I have a very short and maybe admittedly provocative question. Is the dictatorship of the proletariat, according to you, a capitalist form of governance?
All right. So we can finish in the same direction we started. Find inspiration in the questions, but of course, difficult to answer all of them.
So in response to you, I have to be honest that the dictatorship of the proletariat has never been something that's informed my politics ever. And it was only when Theo kind of invited me to speak on this panel that I thought, okay, I'll do some reading around this. What I find far more useful from Marx is Capital, where he doesn't talk about it. Particularly the first line of the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about the history of all hitherto society being the history of class struggle. And that's where I get the idea where I said that, I disagree. I think Olga and Gavin were slightly misrepresenting me, talking about two modes of production existing simultaneously. I don't really think that's certainly not what I meant to say. I apologize if that was the impression I gave, but I do think other tendencies exist within capitalism. And if they didn't, we would never get out of capitalism. That's what I meant by we struggle in capitalism, against capitalism, and beyond capitalism. And it's those struggles against and beyond that we have to look for and amplify. And I can't remember who said, I think it was you who talked about the National Health Service. I'm not a subscriber to the idea that things have to get worse before they can get better. I think, and this relates to the person who talked about the expansion of the European socialist movements happened in times of upturn. I think it's victory even if it's only a partial victory, even if it's a victory that kind of takes the form of capitalism. And yes, I think the NHS has, you know, many, many capitalist elements. It's when we win that we get the confidence to develop our struggles and to say, well, how can we go beyond that?
Yeah, so in terms of the bad press that the dictatorship, the proletariat got from the Soviet Union, Lenin made a run for it on, you know, in a very strange circumstances in a fringe empire that was actually very undeveloped, already had a very small proletariat, tiny compared to the peasants, but decided, you know, this is a revolutionary juncture. We're going to try to seize the moment. And they went for it, and they actually did maintain power. During that period, there was a huge civil war, lasted a long time. A lot of people died of starvation during that period. And then they were invaded by like 17 countries. And then they were always under serious threat completely. They were the only socialist country, completely cordoned off by the rest of the world. They couldn't do foreign trade in any sort of reasonable way. And it created perpetual economic crisis within the Soviet Union. Or the Russian Socialist Republic at the time, and then going into the Soviet Union. And that kind of crisis was very, very, very acute. And then there was a fear that Germany was going to roll them. You know, that Germany was just going to invade them at any moment. And you can read the Central Committee's notes. They're terrified through the 1920s, just absolutely terrified. Created like a paranoia, but not a paranoia that was unjustified, because actually Germany did invade them and then killed 25 million of them. So 25 million people, you know, coming out of the end of the World War II, which the Nazis were only defeated by the Soviet, you know, if the Soviet Union had not defeated them, it would have, you know, been Nazi domination. That's just the reality of it. So that kind of climate is maybe not the most conducive, but they kind of held on to it. What I think is the real shame is like, it may have distorted it internally, and it probably did distort people's understandings externally. But I mean, like PR is not my business. I like to think about theory and what is true and what is useful in terms of social structure and strategic understanding. So I'm willing to use it. I don't have any problem with it, and I don't care about the bad PR so much. I maybe wouldn't put it on a poster trying to get people to, you know, come to socialism for their first time, you know, I don't know. But yeah, in terms of Bonapartism, all social catastrophes are bad for, like, if there's a serious social catastrophe and capitalism goes into immense crisis, that's not good for capital. That actually, you know, they lose money when there are social crises that are very acute. Civil wars can erupt from these sorts of things, and that's not great for capitalists. Sometimes, Theo was mentioning that the dictatorship of the proletariat would have to discipline wayward proletarians during the period of transition. You know, that's not a very nice idea, but I think it's probably true, right? It's also true of capitalists. Sometimes the capitalist state needs to repress capitalists, maybe generally, maybe specific capitalists, or maybe groups of capitalists, in order to reproduce the system. Now, when the ruling class, the capitalist class, the actual people who are involved in it, who have ideas and plan, become decadent, stupid, incapacitated, then they tend to do these things that actually damage social stability, which is really bad for them. Because if they reach a crisis where there's a total crisis of the society, they don't win in that situation. So I think that that's the appropriate understanding. In terms of whether I think, you know, we aim to go beyond that, I'm not aiming for just the NHS. I think the NHS is great. I think you would have to, what I was saying, you wouldn't want to smash the NHS when you had a transition, but we need to transition the mode of production totally. Total transition. So, I mean, I hope that's clear. Like, a number of people seem to be confused as to whether I think we should, like, I mean, full communism is the aim, right? Okay. So in terms of the party form, I think, is the most developed sort of repository of theoretical understanding, and the best way that we can try to move towards merger. So we need a merger of the socialist movement. There are socialist intellectuals. We have no problem getting socialist intellectuals. What we have a problem with is an organic connection between socialist intellectuals and the proletarian movement. That's the problem, right? And the party should be trying to do that. That's what the party is supposed to do.
Well, in 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Fukuyama wrote that this is the end of history. Nothing else is going to happen after that. But now we know, 30 years later, 31, that capitalism is going to crash for a reason, and one reason only, because capitalism consumes its own resources. It has nothing else to consume, so it has no resources. It's like he's out of fuel. Because he's a guy in my mind. So, okay. So, is it the end of history or not? And I really want to ask, do we have working class movements right now? Because I think we don't. I think we don't have any movements at all, only little ones, or maybe we have the great movement of Me Too, who has a great instability between it. Sometimes feminists can be really brutal to each other because they're capitalist feminists and radical feminists, etc. The same things happens with the climate crisis movement. The same things happens with all these kinds of movements. But we don't have a working class movement anywhere in Europe or in the world. So maybe if we want to discuss about the next page and the next day and the next chapter, we have to create it. Because I think you said that there are so many socialist intellectuals, but we're in no contact with the working class and the precariats and everybody who is like, it obviously us, but not on our high horses talking about it so much. So we need to create movements. We need to listen to society and let the society guide us to movements. But right now, we don't have any. We don't have any movements possible to win anything crucial right now. And that's my opinion. So it's not the end of history. It's the end of an era, though. And we should organize like yesterday.
Okay. The Paris Commune, that Ephraim mentioned, should have been perhaps discussed more. Marx praised it as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but simultaneously criticized it for not being, let's say, dictatorial enough in two senses. In two instances, it didn't confiscate the Parisian treasures of the Parisian banks. They were hesitant because this money were not Parisian money. They were of the whole nation. So did they have the right to do it? The danger of paralysis. They didn't attack the Versailles. Did they have the right to attack their competitor for governance or not? Politics open up this kind of difficult questions, and we have to be prepared to address them in non-idyllic conditions. Because of Bonapartism, Marx famously wrote that the empire, Bonapartism, domestic despotism, was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost and the working class had not yet acquired the faculty of ruling the nation. The direct antithesis to the empire was the commune. During the bourgeois revolutions, the bourgeoisie still had the faculty, it had acquired the faculty of ruling the nation. There wasn't this void into which capitalist politics fall. About the party question, exactly because the capitalists, of course, are a problem to be addressed. But as Marx said, it's the character masks of capital. They are an epiphenomenon of capital. So it's not as if we need a party of the whole class against the capitalists. We have also to address the divisions within the working class. So the dictatorship of the proletariat is an international phenomenon employing multiple parties of the working class contesting for power in democratic forms, not dictatorial forms, but they contest with each other. And USSR was not an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat because it failed to expand to the countries where the production was accumulated and concentrated. And about the question, the provocative question, if the DOP is a capitalist form of government, I mean, it smashes the dictatorship of the proletariat, according to Marx, it smashes the capitalist form of government in order to make, for the first time, the problem of capital acute and up for grabs for the working class to put it back to the scrap heap of history.
All right.
That's it.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming.